trying to lay that as groundwork for the notion of, are we misidentifying kids, and is there a problem with disproportionality? First of all, there is a problem with disproportionality. If you just look at the numbers, it's clear there's a problem. If there were no problem, the same percentage of white, African American, Asian American, Native American, etc., their percentage in the population would be mirrored in the population in special education. And that just doesn't happen. So what we have to say is, first of all, the point I think I've made, we're not over-identifying EBD. Okay, we're only identifying 0.8% or less than 1%. Very few people are arguing, we're identifying too many kids. In fact, I've never heard that argument. I mean, and again, think about who's identified and served in your school or your district. Do you want to take half of them off the special ed rolls? Maybe some people argue that. I've never heard a credible argument for that. So we're not over-identifying, but this disproportionality is apparent in most categories of disability, including EBD, and the basic trend is this: African American students over-identified or proportionally identified at a greater rate, and then the groups that are typically disproportionately under-identified, Asian, Pacific Islander, and Hispanic. Those two groups tend to show up. There's some variations. I don't expect you to read this chart. This is from Russ Skiba's group, and you guys may know Russ Skiba. This is from a 2008 article. Hard to read all this, but this is this notion of risk ratio. I'm going to give a smaller version of it. The idea is if your group, your ethnic group, whatever it is reflected in the special education roles at the same rate as it occurs in the population, your risk ratio is 1. If more of your group is identified, that ratio goes above 1. If less of your group is identified, that ratio goes below 1. Okay, so the number's a little complicated to calculate, but it's a number. Again, that's the whole chart, but let me break it down and give you sort of half at a time. This group, I carved out the categories just eyeballing it. I went down that list and I said, which of these are closer to 1? Closest to 1. So this is the however many 8 or 10 categories that I thought were closest to 1. So less disproportionality. And look across, I think I highlight a couple. Look across, I think I decided visual impairment, again, just eyeballing it, was probably the closest. These do not vary from 1 by much at all. So there's not a lot of disproportional identification going on. That category is visual impairment. Why would there be less disproportionality in visual impairment?
You're blind.
You're blind or you're not, right? You can see or you're not. Is the E pointing that way or that way? Well, okay, I'm being videotaped, so I have to be careful, but there's not a lot of cultural difference around identifying the direction things are pointing. Or what's the visual screenings now for the little kids? I just had my eyes checked, and you're reading letters, but for little kids, it was like an E, or it was pointing in different directions. Because I so remember kindergarten standing there, and you had to hold your hand, and you had to go like this and say which direction the thing was pointing. Cover one eye. Do you ever do that? No one's my age. You didn't do that back in 1972. I don't know what they do now in terms of screen, in terms of what the picture is the kid has to identify. But again, not a lot of subjectivity. Look across the categories. The same argument probably exists. Skiba and them use the term hard. There's a lot of hard signs of these disabilities as opposed to soft signs, meaning subjective assessments or observations that require some subjectivity. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Now, what are the other categories I left out? Learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, emotional disturbance, OHI. Look at the variation that cut across here. I think the biggest number occurs in the intellectual disabilities category, and if you can read that, do you see there's a 3 in there? I mean, if a number is 1.2, I don't get so nervous. A 3 means 3 times as many African American students as occur in the population, their percentage of the population, are identified in the category of intellectual disabilities. So that's the most whopping. Unfortunately, I think the next highest number occurs in the category of emotional disturbance. And again, it's African American students. 2.25 in terms of disproportional identification. Just going to let that soak in for a moment. I can make an argument, and we're going to talk about the reasons disproportionality occurs. Poverty is the first thing that comes to people's mind. And they say, well, poverty, we know, causes risk for disability. And I'll argue that till I die. And so if you want to take me on, bring it on. We're on videotape. Poverty puts kids at risk. No question. Absolutely no question. The resources, start from the beginning. Teen pregnancy, prenatal care, postnatal care, health care generally, resources in the home, language spoken in the home, meaningful differences, anyone? Is that the book? Meaningful Differences. Help me out. Come on, somebody. Meaningful Differences. I'm going to blank on the names. Hart and Risley. Meaningful Differences. It's a short book, but they capture data on language spoken in homes, and I can't give you the numbers because I don't have them memorized, but it's something that would just blow your mind. In an impoverished environment, people below the poverty line, a kid will enter school having heard 100,000 words. Kid from upper income, middle and upper income, enters school having heard 1.5 million words, or some just incredibly mind-blowing difference just in language exposure and interaction. That's a problem. So poverty puts kids at risk across all categories of disability. Now, but remember, the point, so one argument I would make is that might be accounting for a decent amount of that 3 being where it is. Intellectual disabilities in particular. But I'll switch back to emotional disturbance. Skiba is quick to point out that when they analyze poverty in terms of disproportionality, it doesn't capture all of that difference. So the point I would make is poverty puts kids at risk for disability. But when we start picking apart, okay, why is that number 2.25 and Hispanic number 0.52? Poverty doesn't explain that, because the poverty differential there is not that whopping. Does that make sense? That overall poverty is a problem. So I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that if you want to fix education, poverty should be very near the top of your list. But it doesn't explain disproportionality within categories. It probably accounts for some, but it doesn't explain it all. So what's going on there? Thoughts on any of those numbers? Make sense? You buy that? You buy the premise? Here are the possible explanations people have floated for disproportionality. Just what, again, I told you up front, I don't have answers. These are the possible explanations people have talked about. Test bias, huge. When I was getting into special ed, we talked about that a lot, and we looked at tests, and we found bias in them. And that was a long time ago. So tests are a lot better now. I don't think there's any such thing as a culture-free or bias-free test, but they've done a great job of limiting bias, or minimizing it also. So anyway, we'll talk about each of these. Test bias is one argument, that we're so biased against kids of different cultures that the tests end up identifying. Poverty, we talked about. Teacher diversity and cultural mismatch. I worked in, I don't know where it ranked, but one of the larger urban districts in the country. I won't name it, but a big city that you all know. Not here, not Indianapolis. Where many of the schools I went in were 100% African American students. And, you know where I'm going? virtually 100% suburban white female teachers who drove into the city to teach. Cultural mismatch is what people have alluded to as being part of the problem, part of the equation. We'll talk about that a little. School climate and expectations. I think that's very much related to this. It's talking about a mismatch. It's talking about what is the climate and what are the expectations in a given school, and does that match the population and the culture of that population that's showing up on that doorstep. Achievement and classroom management. And I'm going to pick those apart specifically. Those are the ones I want to talk about. What's going on academically in this school? How are kids achieving? What does instruction look like? What does progress look like over time for those kids? And classroom management. How efficient is it? How positive is it? How effective is it? So I think if you find a school with really low achievement and really atrocious classroom management, you're going to see all these other problems go hand in hand with it. So let's look at those briefly. Test bias, I think, existed in a dramatic fashion throughout the last century. Dramatic fashion. I mean, we saw that. When I was an undergrad, we picked apart test items, and you'd see things like, you know, an item that had little pictures, and it was a picture of a toaster oven and a microwave and a coffee pot and something else. A kid from a poor rural area probably never seen any of those. Or if they have, they've only seen them in books or on tests. Kids who grow up with that stuff, you know, it's like putting 4 farm implements across the thing and identify which one. If you grow up in Brooklyn, you're not going to know that. There were examples of that. I mean, just insane examples of that on tests. And so the bias was just clear. And we have that in our history. I think tests are a lot better now. People will still argue that there's a dominant culture around, and that gets at school expectations, and you know, and I don't discount that at all. I think that still exists, but I think the test instruments themselves are better, not perfect, but better, and I don't think that accounts for much of what we're talking about with EBD, because remember, that kid has to have an adverse effect on their educational performance, not due to intellectual, you know, they're achieving at a normal rate. So a test, a standardized test, is really not a big part of the equation for EBD. So I'm sort of setting test bias aside. I don't think it's a problem for EBD. If we're going to talk about intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities, yeah, we're going to have a longer discussion. Poverty, we already said, certainly explains some of the discrepancy, but not all. There's been a few studies on this. Skiba has done at least one of them. Donald Oswald is a guy in Virginia who's written a couple of these. Interestingly, if I can capture this correctly, what they find is disproportionality is greatest in lower poverty schools. It's always confusing even when I say it. Lower poverty meaning higher SES. Wealthier suburban schools. That's an overgeneralization, but wealthier suburban schools are going to have greater disproportionality. Poor schools, inner city, poor schools, rural, less disproportionality. People speculate on why that is. You can sort of argue back to that cultural mismatch maybe. You know, if a kid is acting out, he might stand out more. Frankly, I don't know how else to phrase that. There's a politically correct way to phrase it. He's going to stand out more in a wealthy, white-bread, 98% white community high school or middle school. It makes sense? So that argument might hold. Teacher diversity, it's largely beyond our control, so I don't know what we can do about it. You know, states or school districts can try to address it. I do think that, you know, we can't say, you know, we're going to hire only teachers of this racial, ethnic. I mean, I just don't know. Yeah, okay, we're not going to go there. The cultural mismatch, though, I think can be addressed when we talk about what that means. Whether you're whatever racial ethnic group, what's the culture of the school? What's the focus of the school? Is it on achievement? Is it on social justice? Is it on equity? Is it on a bully-free zone where everyone's valued and respected? Is it all of those things? Does the culture the school establishes match the culture and perspectives of the people who are going to attend that school? What can schools do to establish a relationship that has a cultural match? I've read articles on this. I don't have answers. Again, y'all are going to leave here and say, what did this guy talk about? He had answers to nothing. There's lots written about engaging parents. And the first way to do that, from what I read, is social activities. Having cookouts, having outdoor, field day type events or meet and greets that are not back to school night, come into the classroom, sit in the small desk, and have the teacher at the front of the room tell you, here are my classroom rules, here's the homework folders. If they don't, they get points off. That might not be as useful as working toward having a shared perspective on what our school's about and what the approach is. There's a guy, I spent a lot of time in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's a small city, but big African-American population in the city itself. And one of the principals made news frequently. He was a young guy, happened to be white, and I'm not trying to make a racial or disproportional argument here, but went into the school he was going to work at and made it his goal to visit every home before school started. So this guy walked the streets of the neighborhoods, literally. And the camera crew, TV, followed him around because they're like, he's doing what? He's knocked on doors. Hi, I'm Jim whoever. I'm the new principal at Walker Elementary. Just want to introduce myself. Sat in the living room with parents. Who you got coming to school? Met the two, and then they show him with the little 3-year-old. Oh, so we'll see you in 2 years. I mean, this guy spent I don't know how many hours trying to establish a relationship with people and trying to establish a school that was a place that parents wanted to be and wanted to be a part of and wanted to contribute to, and on and on and on. I can say that, but that's a big challenge. And I don't have a specific answer or checklist, but what I read is that's one of the keys to getting that cultural match to happen. Climate and expectations I talked about as well. It's sort of the same thing. That's when you talk about what are our school-wide disciplinary practices. Are parents involved in that discussion and decision making? Are students involved in that discussion and decision making? Or is it a top-down model that just says you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this? These are the ones, though, that I think teachers impact directly. So when we're talking about, or teachers or building level professionals, these are the ones you impact directly. You can't change the cultural mix of your staff, generally. But you can address achievement and classroom management. Now, when we talk about achievement, remember, I already said kids with EBD generally have by definition, have intelligence within the normal range, so they have the ability to achieve. But why is achievement so important? Because this isn't like learning disabilities, where we might be looking for specific academic gains or gaps or discrepancies. For kids with EBD, when I talk about achievement, what I'm talking about is, are they engaged in instruction, and is that instruction effective? Because if they start failing in first grade and second grade and third grade, and they can't read very well, I can guarantee you're going to have behavior problems that are going to outweigh any academic problems you have in fourth and fifth and sixth grade. If they don't master basic skills early on, the odds of behavior problems later on go way, way, way up. So when we talk about achievement, this is kind of a new thing in the field of BD. It only got talked about probably beginning around the year 2000, which is ironic. I don't know why we missed it. If you want to limit behavior problems in a school, one of the first things you need to look at is instruction. Is it effective? Is it engaging students? Think about, I hope that's obvious to everyone, but when I teach my classes, some students are like, okay, how does that help? They'll get better grades, but they still have bad behavior. If I engage a second grader in a lesson and he learns to read, I now have multiple opportunities to say, great job, Philip. You are jamming on this reading. I'm going to put a star on your chart. You're at level 3. If you finish this by Friday, you'll be in level 4 next week. How many times do I have the chance to have that positive conversation of rewarding him for an academic achievement? Kids with EBD never hear that stuff. There's studies that show they don't hear anything positive, even when they do something positive. Drives me up a wall. There's some great studies on this. Kids with EBD get yelled at, corrected, reprimanded at a higher rate. And people say, of course they do. Look at the behavior they're engaging in. But these studies also show that even when they do what they're supposed to be doing, they get way less acknowledgement or approval for that. If I can teach them how to read, how to do math, how to do some basic skill stuff in a positive lesson where I can say 30 times in a half an hour lesson, good job, nice going. You're jamming on reading now, man. I can start tipping that balance. So don't lose sight of achievement. You know, people, and I was the same way as a teacher. I wanted to focus so much on behavior because that's what was in my face, and I feared for my life. It's a slight exaggeration, but only slight once I got to middle school. But instruction needed to be the focus. We talk about structure. I talk about structure a lot. That is not rigidity. We do not need military-style desks in rows. By structure, I mean predictability. At 8 o'clock, you get your folder out. At 8:15, you turn in your folder and pick up the book and go to your center or go to wherever. Predictability and routine is huge. And increased engagement, and that's around instruction. I list a few evidence-based practices here. I think I'm going to talk about a couple of these in my other one. Maybe not. Never mind. I'm only covering like one of these in my other session. Are we doing stuff like OTRs, opportunities to respond? Go into a classroom that includes kids with EBD and see how many opportunities to respond they had. You know OTRs? Opportunities to respond? How many times are they called on? How many times are they asked a question? Or are they just sitting in the back and they never interact at all? The rates are sadly, sadly low. An EBD kid can sit through 7th period science and never say a word. That shouldn't happen. They should have lots of OTRs. Class-wide peer tutoring is CWPT. That's just another great strategy. I'm a big fan of direct instruction. I don't know if you are. It gets poo-pooed by a lot of groups. For basic skills, for engagement in lessons, for the opportunity for me to say, good job, nice going, good reading, 30 times a lesson, direct instruction is a great way to go. And behavior-specific praise. That's just the new term used for praise. You know, teacher praise, that gets bashed in the popular media. Kids are praised too much. Not kids with behavior disorders. I guarantee you they're not. Behavior-specific praise is you don't walk around saying, good boy, nice job. Great job, Alan. That paragraph has a beautiful topic sentence and you got 3 supporting details. You just got to tell them what you're praising them for crying out loud. Behavior-specific praise. Do we do that? We know those don't occur a lot for kids with behavior disorders. That's the problem. Classroom management. It's basic stuff. Positive expectations, acknowledgement for positive behavior, judicious punishments. Now I'm using the term punishment in the behavioral sense, which just means anything that results in a decrease in behavior. I'm not talking about paddling kids or punishing in your grandmother's vernacular. Response cost is the primary means of punishment. That's a loss of points, loss of privileges, loss of an earned reinforcer. I'm on video, so I'm not advocating aversive punishments at all. Judicious punishments, that's what characterizes most school-wide models, right? If you got one in place, hopefully you're doing all that stuff. Here's a point I'd love to make, though, and I wish I had some sort of detailed way to do this. We have got to focus on behavior as opposed to our interpretations of behavior. I talk about an operational definition. You know an operational definition means it's observable and it's measurable. Right? It's a definition that we can agree on. Whether it's a good or bad definition, we can agree on it. Okay? If I say that behavior occurred 7 times, you're going to agree it occurred 7 times. Now, I might need a different definition, or it might not be the right definition for this behavior, but the first step is, can we agree on whether that occurred or not? When I teach my students this, we start with things that we think are operational, and then they say, I don't know. So I'll say, out of seat behavior. And I'll have them count. I'll do a little role play. I'll say, watch how many times I get out of my seat. And then I'll go through, I'll be sitting at my seat. And then I'll do this. And then I'll do this while I'm doing my work, You kids do this sometimes, right? And then I'll stand here and hold on to my chair. And the students will say, you got out of your seat 3 times. And another will say, I got 7. You got out of a seat 7 times. What are you talking about? It's really hard to have an operational definition. I think on my next slide, I give you an example of language that should probably never be used in an IEP, in a behavior intervention plan, in an office discipline referral, in anything. Disruptive. You ever send a kid to the office and he was disruptive in class? I mean, I would use a red pen and send that back and say, fill this form out better. What's disruptive, for crying out loud? What's disrespectful? And I just threw this in as a pet peeve. Any phrase with the word attitude showed a bad attitude. When corrected, showed a negative attitude toward the teacher. I don't know what that is. I probably do know what that is. But that is so like the definition of EBD in federal language that it is unhelpful. I think this is where the door gets opened for subjectivity related to disproportionality. At least I don't have a good argument to say why that's okay. Now when I work with individual special ed teachers, students training to be special ed teachers or in a school, we can talk through this very easily. We have a whole class, although I haven't taught it in a while, where we work through that sort of, what do you call it? Not almost a coaching is the new buzzword, but sort of an interview with a colleague, So tell me about Johnny's behavior. Oh my gosh, he's out of control. Well, so he's out of control. When is he out of control? All day. All day long, really. Well, so when does it start? Oh, well, it starts in math. Okay, so he's out of control in math. Tell me what out of control means. And you do this interview to get at behaviors. Whatever it is, out of seat, talking out, breaking pencils, throwing pencils, hitting people, using profanity, touching other people, behaviors that initially are out of control, disrespectful, disruptive, has a bad attitude. This is not justifiable. I mean, it's really hard to justify. Now, the teacher and the principal and the instructional aide and all the other kids will agree 100%, yeah, that was really disruptive. But I need to know what happened. What did he do? Remember, we're talking about identification of EBD and the notion of disproportional identification, which is a subjective thing. We agreed that there's some subjectivity going on. If we're going to use language like that, we're going to have a problem with that subjectivity. The other ways are things we talk about for all classroom management. Inconsistency in how you implement or interpret a rule. You're dead in the water if you find yourself saying, well, all right, you didn't get all your points today, but tomorrow you better earn, you only got 9 out of 10, so I'm going to let you go today, but tomorrow, I tell students all the time, don't do that. And the undergrads are always like, oh, come on, don't you have to show flexibility and empathy? And I'm like, are you kidding me? 10 points is 10 points. You didn't earn 10 points, you're not going outside. Right? Are you with me, EBD crowd? Oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many kids not earning their points, not earning their points. And I'm reminding them, you got to earn your points. You only got 7. We're going out to recess in 20 minutes. I'll do it, I'll do it. You know, they're laying in the floor reading a comic book. I'll do it, I'll do it. Then they start working because they see the clock ticking. Work, work, work. Oh no, I got it. Mr. Landrum, I got it. No worries, come on, I'm working. Look, one more, got one more to do. Time. Sorry, Russell, you only got 9 points. Yeah, but I'm working. Look, I only need one more. I'll do it after. Sorry. No flexibility. I'm going to implement this plan consistently. I hope you'll do better tomorrow. Now, why am I nervous about that? Because I just created what they call a behavioral earthquake. Because now I got to do, it's so much easier for me to say, all right. But don't let me see you doing that again tomorrow, Russell. Of course he's going to do it tomorrow. I just taught him very efficiently how to do that. We've got to be consistent in implementation. And then emphasizing negative behavior or rule violations. I just taught a class. It ended this past week. People had to turn in their classroom management plan. One of them sent me this list that was nothing but negatives. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. Now I did question and she said that's how her school's set up. And I'm like, you don't have there's nothing that earns kids points? And she's like, no, it's all warning level 1, green light 2, yellow light plus warning equals parent, phone call plus email. Elaborate system of punishments or of negative consequences. And I just thought, seriously, there's nothing. And she did finally at the end say, well, I try to build in some positives in my classroom, but they don't really do it in the school. And I'm like, you're barking up the wrong tree. So anyway, those things lead to problems as well.